Shadows beyond the campfire. On the border of the American state of Oregon, in the dense forests covered with fog, there is a place that locals call Black Forest. This place is hidden from the eyes of tourists. It cannot be found on any map, but rumors about it are passed from mouth to mouth. They say that people disappear in these forests, and only a few return. They never tell what happened to them, and their eyes become empty, as if they have looked into the heart of horror. A group of 5 friends decided to spend the weekend camping. Billy, the leader of the company, found an article about the uncharted forests of America and became eager to find one of those places. His friend Jack claimed to know a suitable place that the locals avoided. Along with them went Sarah, Lisa, and Kevin, a typical youthful bunch, eager for adventure. "Are you sure this is a good idea?" Lisa asked as they loaded their things into the old SUV. "Absolutely," Jack replied, smiling broadly. "I was there a couple years ago. The place is perfect. No tourists, just nature and fresh air." They drove for several hours until their GPS began to lose signal. The forest around them was getting thicker and thicker. The trees seemed to rise up to the sky, and the silence outside the window seemed ominous. "Should we go back?" Sarah suggested, feeling a growing uneasiness. "It'll be all right," Billy said, turning onto the barely visible trail. "This is an adventure, not a picnic in a city park." They camped in a small clearing surrounded by a dense forest. When they lit the fire, the night shrouded everything around them. No stars were visible, as if the sky itself had disappeared, and the sounds of the forest seemed too loud, as if someone were watching them. "This forest is weird," Lisa said, looking at the shadows dancing around the fire. "Come on," Jack grinned, throwing another branch into the fire. It was just strange. But after a few hours, the oddities began to multiply. First, Kevin heard whispering, as if from deep in the woods. Then Sarah noticed the trees moving, even though there was no wind. "Do you feel it too?" she asked, her voice trembling. "What?" Billy raised his head. "That look," as if someone was watching from the darkness. The next morning, Kevin wasn't in the tent. His belongings were still intact, but there was no sign of the boy. Maybe he just went for a walk, Jack suggested, though there was fear in his voice. "No shoes?" Sarah pointed to his boots, neatly placed by the fire. They searched the entire camp and the immediate surroundings, but Kevin was nowhere to be found. When they returned to the tents, they discovered something even creepier. Strange symbols appeared on the ground around the campfire, as if scorched into the earth. Chapter 4. Symbols and Fear. Sarah stood over the strange signs, trying to figure out their meaning. They looked like crude drawings, but each line was scorched as if the ground beneath them was on fire. "Maybe he made them?" Lisa asked, trying to deal with her anxiety. "Kevin?" Jack shook his head. "That was impossible. He wouldn't know how to do something like that." Billy, who had been silent all this time, suddenly moved closer. "These signs," he began. "They look like a warning." "A warning? A warning of what?" Sarah was almost screaming, her voice shaking. Billy only shrugged. He couldn't explain where he got the feeling from, but the signs gave him an inexplicable dread. Throughout the day, they continued to search for Kevin, going deeper and deeper into the woods. The trees grew denser and the air heavier. Every step was accompanied by a strange rustling sound, as if someone was following them. "We have to go back," Lisa said, grabbing Jack's hand. "This place, it's not right. We can't leave Kevin." Billy cut him off. Still, as the sun began to slip toward the horizon, they returned to the camp empty-handed. New signs had appeared on their path. They were in the trees, as if someone had carved them in a matter of hours. The night became even scarier. The forest seemed to come alive. They heard something sneaking through the dense bushes, heard a low whisper that came from everywhere and nowhere at the same time. "I can't take it anymore," Sarah said, clutching the flashlight. And then there was a scream. It was so loud and shrill it took everyone's breath away. It was Kevin. "It was him," Jack shouted. "He's in here somewhere." Everyone scrambled out of their seats, pointing their flashlights into the darkness. The shout came again, closer this time. They ran, not noticing how far they were getting from the camp. They found Kevin. He was standing with his back to them, on his knees, in the middle of a small clearing. "Kevin!" Billy rushed toward him, but when he turned him to face him, he froze. Kevin's face was dead pale, and his eyes were completely black. "Go away!" He wheezed before collapsing to the ground. Kevin had to be carried back to the camp. He didn't regain consciousness, but his body was ice cold. Sarah noticed that there were signs on his hands as well, the same ones scorched on the ground. "We have to leave," she said quietly. "What if he dies?" Billy looked nervously at Kevin. "We can't leave him in that condition." They decided to wait until morning to get him out of the forest. But during the night, the forest came alive again. Now strange sounds were added to the whispers, as if someone was laughing, but the voice was inhuman. Lisa suddenly began to scream, pointing to the trees. There, among the branches, shadows flickered. They didn't move, but just stared at the camp. "Who are you?" Billy shouted, grabbing the flashlight and pointing it at the trees. But the shadows disappeared as if they had never been there. When morning came, they found that the road they had come on had disappeared. In its place was a solid wall of trees. "That's impossible," Jack muttered, looking at the map. "This is where we came from." They tried to find a way out, but it was as if the forest was changing. The path leading to rescue was closing, like a maze. Kevin finally woke up. His eyes were blank and his voice quiet. "You shouldn't have come here." "What do you mean?" Billy asked, shaking him awake. "This forest, it's alive, and it wants us." Kevin told him that at night he had heard a voice calling him deep into the forest. That voice promised him freedom, but as soon as he got too far away, he realized he was trapped. The forest came alive and the shadows began to draw closer. "The only way to leave," Kevin began but didn't finish. At that moment, the shadows reappeared. They surrounded the camp. This time they didn't disappear, but started moving slowly towards them. "We have to run," Sarah shouted, but Kevin stopped them. "It's no use. The forest demands a sacrifice." He rose to his feet, looked at his friends, and took a step towards the shadows. "Kevin, don't," Lisa shouted. "It's the only way," he whispered before disappearing into the darkness. Chapter 9. Salvation? The next morning they woke up in their tents. The forest was back to normal, bright and quiet. But Kevin was gone. Was it a dream? Lisa asked, looking at the others. But Billy noticed symbols scorched into the ground. No, it was real. They had returned to civilization. But each of them felt that the forest had taken not only Kevin with it, but a part of themselves. There were still whispers in their nightmares, and familiar shapes flickered in the shadows. After returning home, each of the survivors tried to forget their experiences. But it wasn't so easy. Lisa, Sarah, Billy, and Jack no longer felt safe, not even in their homes. Sarah was the first to notice the strangeness. One night, coming home from work, she saw familiar signs on the wall of her house. They were the same symbols they had seen in the woods. No, not that," she whispered, grabbing her phone and dialing Billy's number. "Are you seeing it too?" Billy interrupted her as soon as he answered the phone. "They're everywhere. On the street, in my yard." "What do you mean?" Sarah asked. "Symbols. They appear where they shouldn't be. And at night I hear whispers, just like in that forest." Sarah felt her heart clench with fear. "Lisa and Jack, we should check to see if they're okay." When they arrived at Lisa's apartment, the door to her apartment was open. Inside was utter chaos. Furniture was overturned, things were strewn across the floor, and there were symbols on the walls again. "Lisa!" shouted Sarah, running through the rooms. But Lisa was nowhere to be found. The only thing lying on her bed was her cell phone, its screen glowing. The last message was open on it. "The shadows came for me. Couldn't run away. I'm sorry. They took her?" whispered Jack, who had just pulled up and seen the message. "Who's they?" Billy shouted, grabbing his head. "Those shadows? This forest?" But there was no answer. They began to realize that the forest may have let their bodies go, but it had taken something else: their souls, their peace of mind, their future. Gathering the three of them, they decided to find out what the symbols were and what was going on. In a nearby library, they found an old map of the region where that ominous forest was located. On the map, the place was labeled as Forbidden Land. "It doesn't say anything about this forest," Jack said, flipping through the maps. "But I know there must be someone who knows more about it." They found a local old man who was a historian. His name was Mr. Harper, and he looked like he carried all the secrets of the world with him. "Have you been in those woods?" he asked after hearing their story. "Yes," replied Sarah, "and we lost a friend there. Now our lives have become hell." Mr. Harper took a deep breath. "That forest is not just a place. It's a trap. It was cursed hundreds of years ago. Legend has it that a sacrifice was made there to make a deal with an ancient spirit. The forest has been demanding more sacrifices ever since. But it's not just the forest itself. When you entered it, you bound your lives to its curse. Now it will follow you. What do we do? How do we stop it?" Billy asked, clenching his fists. "The only way to break the bond is to go back there. The forest won't let you go until it has its last victim." Despite their fear, they decided to go back. Sarah, Billy and Jack loaded everything they needed into the car again and set off. This time, only dead silence accompanied them. When they reached the forest, its atmosphere had changed. It was no longer the usual dense forest. Now it seemed alive. Its trees moved even when there was no wind, and the very same whispering sounded from the depths. "We have to find the place where we were last," Billy said. Their journey seemed endless, but soon they came again to the very clearing where Kevin had disappeared. The symbols on the ground began to glow with a faint red light, and shadows appeared in front of them. The shadows didn't attack, but they gradually drew closer. They no longer looked shapeless. They now looked like humans, but with elongated faces and black empty eyes. "What do you want?" Sarah shouted. But the answer was obvious. The forest demanded a sacrifice. "I'll do it," Jack said suddenly, stepping forward. "No, we have to find another way," Billy shouted, trying to stop him. "This is the only way," Jack replied. "We can't run anymore." He stepped into the center of the clearing. The shadows immediately surrounded him, and he disappeared into their embrace. At the same moment, the light from the symbols went out and the forest was filled with dead silence. Sarah and Billy left the forest the next day. This time, he didn't try to detain them. They felt that the curse was gone, but they still couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. When they returned home, they saw that the signs no longer appeared. The whispers were gone. But a few months later, waking in the night, Sarah looked out the window and froze. Outside, in the shade of a tree, stood a figure with empty black eyes. The forest may have let them go, but the shadows would never go away completely. Chapter 16. Ghosts of the Forest. Sarah couldn't move. The figure outside the window was motionless, but its presence pressed on, as if an invisible weight was constricting her breathing. She slowly reached for the phone to call Billy, but when she averted her gaze for a moment and looked outside again, the figure was gone. Sarah didn't sleep a wink all night. In the morning, she called Billy and told him what she had seen. It was real, Billy. The forest was making itself known again. Billy, who had been trying to convince himself that it was over, felt his confidence crumble. "If the forest wants us back, it will find a way," he said hoarsely. "I can feel it too." Searching for answers, Sarah thought back to Kevin's house. He had always been someone who liked to write down his thoughts and keep journals. She and Billy decided to go there. Kevin's house stood abandoned, dusty and covered in cobwebs. In his room, they found an old box of notebooks and notes. Most of the entries seemed ordinary until they came across the journal he had kept before the trip. "I know the forest is calling me. I heard it dreaming long before we decided to go there. The voice promises me something great, but I feel there is darkness behind it. If anyone is reading this, it means I couldn't save myself. A forest is not just a place. It's something alive. It finds the weak and plays on their fears. But I'm sure if you follow the signs, you can find its source. Maybe it can help stop it for good." These notes made Sarah and Billy shudder. "He knew about this before the trip," Sarah whispered, "and he kept it from us." "But what does he mean by source?" Billy asked, frantically flipping through the pages. Kevin's notes mentioned another symbol they hadn't seen before. It was a circle with 3 intertwined lines inside it. There was a notation next to it: "Source of the forest's power. Find and destroy." They realized that perhaps the curse had not disappeared because the evil itself continued to exist. And now the forest, weakened by their past visit, wanted to regain control. "We have to go back," Billy said. "It's the only way to end this." Sarah nodded, though her heart was clenched with fear. They prepared better this time. They took maps, flashlights, knives, and even a can of gasoline, deciding that if the source could be destroyed, they would burn everything to the ground. When they returned to the forest, its atmosphere had changed again. It became even darker, with the air heavy with whispers. Every step echoed, as if the forest was watching them. They walked for hours, following the descriptions in Kevin's journal. The symbols that had been mentioned had indeed begun to appear in the trees, pointing the way. At sunset, they reached a place that was completely different. It was a huge clearing covered with the very signs they had seen before. In the center was an old stone altar covered in moss. Sarah felt everything inside her clench with fear. "This is it," she whispered. Suddenly the forest began to move. Shadows appeared from everywhere, surrounding them but not attacking. They just watched as an invisible force seemed to be waiting to see what they would do. "Hurry up," shouted Billy, pulling out the gasoline. They poured the fuel onto the altar, and Sarah lit a match. The fire flared up, engulfing the stone. For a moment it seemed like nothing was happening, but then there was a loud howl. The ground beneath them shook and the shadows began to move faster. They tried to reach the fire, but they could not cross the circle of light that had suddenly formed around the altar. The light grew brighter and brighter until they heard one last heartbreaking scream and the shadows disappeared. When it was over, the forest was completely different. The silence was real, and the air was no longer pressurized. Sarah and Billy left the clearing, sure that it was over. But before they left the forest, they noticed that the signs on the trees were gone. Only one remained, scorched in their path. It's not over yet. Several weeks passed after Sarah and Billy returned home. They tried to live their lives as before, but something had changed. Despite the destruction of the altar, the feeling of unease never left them. Sarah began to notice strange things. Flickering shadows at the edge of her vision, rustles that couldn't be coincidental, and nightmares where the forest was calling to her again. Billy, on the other hand, became increasingly withdrawn. He avoided talking about what had happened and even his friends. Sarah felt that they were both starting to drift apart, as if something was breaking their bond. One evening Sarah decided to sort through the rest of their belongings from their last trip. Among Kevin's books, maps, and notes, she found an old audio cassette tape. There were no marks on it except for one phrase written in red marker: "The forest always remembers." Sarah inserted the cassette into the old player and pressed play. At first there was silence, but then rustles began, reminiscent of the sound of wind in the trees. Then a voice. It was Kevin. "If you're listening to this, then I'm already gone. The forest isn't just a place. It's an entity. It doesn't want to be destroyed. It wants to spread. You thought you burned his heart out? No, it was just a knot in its web. The real power of the forest is the shadows. They're already in you." Kevin's voice broke, replaced by a familiar whisper. Sarah dropped the player and bounced when she heard her name in that whisper. The next day, Sarah tried to call Billy, but his phone was disconnected. She drove to his house and found the door open. Inside, it looked as if Billy had left the house in a hurry. There was a note on the table. "I can feel them again. They're calling me back." "I'm sorry, Sarah." Sarah realized he had gone back into the woods. Without thinking, she grabbed the car and followed him. When Sarah entered the forest again, it didn't look the way she remembered it. The trees seemed dead and the air was saturated with something sinister. She shouted Billy's name, but the answer was only an echoing whisper. After walking a few miles, she came to a new clearing. This time there was no altar. Instead, Billy stood in the center. His eyes were as black as Kevin's had been that fateful day. "You shouldn't have come back," he said, his voice sounding both familiar and foreign at the same time. "Billy, this isn't you. Fight," Sarah screamed. "This isn't fighting, Sarah. It's acceptance. We're part of the forest. We've always been apart." The shadows began to surround Sarah. They seemed stronger than before. She tried to run away, but felt her feet sticking to the ground. "No, I won't let this happen," she shouted, pulling out the lighter she still carried. She set fire to the nearest bush. The fire began to spread. The shadows howled as if they were being slashed and began to retreat. "You can't destroy the forest," Billy whispered before he disappeared into the flames along with the shadows. Sarah sprinted out of the forest, running with her last strength through the fog that was beginning to thicken. She didn't look back until she was at her car. Turning around, she saw the forest going up in flames. But instead of relief, fear gripped her. From far away in the flames, she could make out the outline of figures standing still and watching her. She left, but the whispers didn't stop. A few months later, Sarah moved to another city, hoping to put it all behind her. But late one night, she heard a knock on the door. When she opened it, she saw a small piece of charred wood. On it was carved the symbol of the forest. And behind her back, the familiar whisper sounded again. "You'll never escape." Chapter 27. Impossible Escape. Sarah froze, clutching the doorknob. The symbol on the charred wood seemed alive. Its lines seemed to pulsate. She closed the door abruptly, locked all the locks and sat on the floor, shivering. The whispering grew louder. It was everywhere. Outside the window, in the walls, in her head. "No, no, no, no," she mumbled, covering her ears with her hands. "It's over." But the forest knew she was wrong. The next day, Sarah decided to find help. She contacted a local journalist who specialized in mystery stories. His name was Thomas Laywood, and he had written articles about unexplained phenomena many times. When Sarah told him everything, Thomas looked skeptical, but promised to investigate. "If this curse really exists, we need to figure out how it works. Maybe it can be destroyed by more than just fire." Together, they began researching the stories of other people who had ever visited this forest. It turned out that over 10 people had disappeared there in the last 100 years, and several more told of strange shadows following them home. Thomas offered to meet one of the survivors, an elderly woman named Martha Wheatley, who had been in the woods over 40 years ago. Martha met them in her home, which was packed with amulets, candles, and books on the occult. "Do you think you destroyed the forest?" she asked, barely glancing at Sarah. "You've only made it angry. But how do you stop it?" Sarah asked. Martha frowned and nodded at her books. "The forest is not just a place. It's an ancient entity that feeds on fear and pain. It doesn't need sacrifices in the literal sense. It needs the energy of those who are afraid. The only way to end it is to not be afraid." Sarah could hardly believe what she was hearing. Not be afraid? How was that possible? The forest is everywhere. He knows what I'm afraid of. "That's why he's winning," Martha replied. "You have to be stronger." That same night, Sarah returned home and felt that something had changed. As soon as she entered the apartment, the lights flickered and whispers filled the space again. Shadows began to make their way on the walls, their movements chaotic and frightening. Sarah clenched her fists, remembering Martha's words. "I'm not afraid of you," she shouted into the void. But the whispers did not subside. The shadows grew closer, their outlines turning into figures with black empty eyes. Sarah lit the candle Martha had given her and stood in the center of the room. "You can't break me. I'm not yours anymore." The candle flared brightly and the shadows screamed. Retreating, the room became quiet again. The next day, Sarah called Thomas and told him what had happened. "It seems to have worked," she said, but Thomas was silent. "Thomas? Are you there?" His voice, when he finally spoke, was full of fear. "Sarah, I think you should see this." He sent her a picture, an image of the forest taken a few hours ago. The forest was no longer burned. It had regenerated, and the shadows in its depths looked even thicker. "The forest never loses," Thomas whispered. "It just waits." Sarah decided to get far away from the city, from the forest, from everything connected to that place. But wherever she went, the signs kept appearing. In random trees, in night dreams, in the reflection in the car window. One night, she stopped at a gas station in the middle of the desert. When she got back to her car, there was an inscription scratched on her hood. "You'll still come back." Sarah realized the forest isn't just a place. It was a part of herself. The shadows had become part of her life, and there was no getting rid of them. She got into the car and looked in the rearview mirror. There, in the darkness, a familiar figure with black eyes flashed, and she didn't scream anymore. Sarah drove through the endless desert roads, trying to suppress the fear that was beginning to rise up inside her again. Her hands clenched the steering wheel until her knuckles were white, and her heart was beating so loud it felt like it was going to burst out of her chest. She couldn't shake the feeling that the shadows were following her, even in this open, empty space. Every time she stopped, her gaze clung to movements that shouldn't have been there. In the reflection of the rearview, she saw more and more figures standing in the distance, among the dust and rocks. But the real horror was when she began to hear them inside her head. "You won't escape. We'll always be there for you. You belong to us." These whispers grew louder and louder. She tried to ignore them, but it was impossible. Finally, Sarah reached a small town lost in the desert. The streets were almost empty and the buildings looked abandoned. She found the only open hotel and rented a room there. The room was dark and damp, but Sarah didn't care. She just wanted to feel safe, if only for a moment. But the night didn't bring peace. Waking up in the middle of the night to a strange sound, Sarah saw that shadows had begun to appear on the walls of her room. They were barely recognizable, like specks of lantern light outside the window, but they moved with a definite purpose, gathering around her bed. Sarah closed her eyes and tried to remember Martha's words. "The forest feeds on fear. Don't be afraid." But the whispering filled the room again. "Don't be afraid? That's impossible. We are your destiny. You cannot win." Sarah shouted, but her voice was drowned the next morning. Sarah went to the local library, hoping to find some information about forests or ancient entities like the one she had encountered. The local librarian, an older man with shrewd eyes, noticed her desperation. "You look like you're looking for something very important," he said. "I'm looking for answers," Sarah replied. The man silently pulled an old book with a worn cover from under the table. There was no title on it, only a symbol that Sarah had seen in the forest. "This is what you need," he said. Sarah began leafing through the book, and her heart sank. It had everything. Descriptions of ancient forests that were alive, stories of shadows that kidnapped people, and even drawings of altars like the one she'd burned. But one page made her shiver. The essence of the forest cannot be destroyed, can only be transferred. Sarah realized that in burning the altar, she hadn't destroyed evil. She had taken it with her. The forest was part of her now, part of her mind and soul. She ran out of the library and heard the familiar whisper again. This time it sounded like a taunt. "You are our home now." Sarah returned to the inn and in desperation began to look for a way to get rid of the curse. She remembered Kevin's words, "Follow the signs. Find the source." But how do you find the source if it's already inside you? Sarah decided to go back to where it all began. She realized that the only way to break the cycle was to go back to the forest. Gathering her things, she set off on the long journey back to the cursed place. This time the shadows didn't try to stop her. They watched her as she approached her final destination. When she entered the forest, everything around her seemed familiar, yet foreign at the same time. The ground was covered in dead leaves and the trees stood gloomy like silent guards. In the center of the forest, in the very spot where the altar had been, a charred circle now stood. Sarah stepped inside it and felt the cold creeping into her bones. "I'm here," she whispered. What do you want? Shadows began to gather around her, forming human figures. Among them was the figure of Kevin, Billy, and all the others who had fallen victim to the forest. You have to accept us, Kevin said. Or become one of us, Billy added. Sarah was faced with a choice. Fight to the end or surrender to the forest and become part of its essence. I'm not afraid of you, she said, though she was trembling inside. Then prove it. The shadows whispered in unison. She pulled out the knife she had brought with her and raised it to her chest. If the forest wanted to take her soul, she would do it on her own terms. You will not have me. She stabbed herself with the knife, but instead of pain, she felt a warmth that began to spread throughout her body. The shadows screamed as they retreated and the forest began to disappear around her. Sarah woke up in a clearing. The forest was no longer gloomy, and the whispers were gone. She felt a strange relief, as if the curse was truly gone. But when she got home, a new inscription was scratched on her mirror. You may reject us, but we will always find others.